Joaquin with my own micro. And for the following two presentations, now we have invited speakers whose research is dealing with Frei Otto as a teacher. And so from US joined us Rob Whitehead. Welcome. He is an architectural historian whose research focuses on experimental structures, particularly on shells and lightweight spatial systems developed by architects and engineers in the pre-digital area. He also contributed a paper to the book of Joaquin and Anna Maria Meister. And today he will present us his research on Frei Otto as a teacher based on Otto's experiences in the USA. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's an incredible group of people here. I have to say, quite intimidating. We will, everybody who's up here, I don't care who you are, you're going to be feeling it, trust me. Sort of starting with the simple question. And I'm also going to play a bit of a hunch here. We're here because of this enduring connection between thinking and making and learning. And I'm just curious if you in the audience here have participated in education in some way, meaning that you have taught others. Would you please raise your hand? Take a look, folks. Right? That's exactly right. And I think that this is where I wanted to begin, is of all the roles that define Otto's career, perhaps in my opinion, educator fits best. From the beginning of his working life, he defied the conventional expectations for what an educator should do and in what forums this instruction should occur. He operated simultaneously as a designer, a researcher, a builder, an author, orator, a publisher, and an artist. Work in one realm, as we've seen, was generative to all the other realms, and this new knowledge was shared openly. So this work began with a prompt of something that I read from Director Sobek, where he talked about the lack of lectures, the lack of work that was the legacy here, and also the sort of obsession of this place and the work that happened within this place. And, you know, pedagogically, this was not an accident. These things happened. The work was produced, and incredibly inventive work was produced. And I got to wonder, how? Where did it come from? How did this happen? And it struck me that, you know, as somebody who dabbles in construction history, to look backwards. And those who maybe know Otto's first work after his thesis, the Tensile Structures book, was published in 62. So this work was developed from 1954 to 1960, and was a collection of experiments and drawings and models and calculations. And there's some implicit sort of humanitarian work that was involved with many of these pneumatic structures. And if you've seen the book, this is page after page of hundreds of drawings. It's incredible range of work, and it's incredibly inspiring. And I just thought, what was he doing between 1954 and 1960? This is a very relevant question, right? Like, what was happening in this time? History gives us the opportunity to be able to look backwards and say, I think those of you who are educators know that your work has probably been influenced about how you learned. And those of you who probably learned from Otto, you'll probably do that in your own practices. So this first part, talking about his learning, both in the TU Berlin, and then his thesis, and then his early work. Many thanks to our friends at Karlsruhe for access to his sketchbooks as a student. So these are Otto's drawings. They're amazing. They're absolutely incredible. What I wanted you to see here, the biggest takeaway, is that this method of developing sketches was based on case study. How do you know how to make different roof assemblies? You look at it, you draw it. One after another, one after another, one after another, okay? Page after page of these beautifully drawn, incredibly rendered drawings. And then when you get to the higher level of his education, you see this amazing sketch on the right, this proposal for a bent wood structure. And all of it was sort of curved, and he, of course, designed the framework to hold it in place, and he's writing about why it would work and how it would work. This, to me, explains so much, this idea of case study, case study, case study, in order to innovate. That's pedagogy. There it is, thinking, making, right? It's there, inherent in his work. He's a resourceful person, of course, as those who know him know. And so at 25 years old, he, of course, gets a study abroad scholarship at the University of Virginia. And he writes letters to, I mean, look at this list. The Saarinen, Mies van der Rohe, Mendelssohn, Wright, Eameses. Says, hey, I'm coming to America. Can I stop by and see you? And they're all like, sure. And the idea of doing this today is remarkable to me to think about that he was able to do this. And so this is his agenda for his trip. And these are sketches that he made of course, the Lakeshore apartments from Mies van der Rohe and the sketches inside of it. But I'm also highlighting here somebody that's not usually on the list that you read. And that's Fred Severid. Who is Fred Severid? Well, he's a celebrated visionary American structural engineer. He wrote about connections between structural form and nature. If you don't know Fred Severid, I would say he's a kindred spirit to Otto in many, many, many ways, and in fact was the first mentor. So look at the article that Fred Severid wrote here. It's called Turtles and Walnuts, Morning Glories and Grass, 1945. This very much aligns with what we've seen from the previous lectures, is this idea of where does the connection between structural form and materials come from? From nature, the inspiration for it. So because he met with the Saarinens knew Severid and said, you should stop by and see Fred Severid. And he did. And so he saw this sketch, actually a model of Matthew Nowicki's work at the Dorton Arena. You'll notice this from, of course, his thesis. He wrote then, started correspondence with Severid, said, that model was one of the most interesting things I've seen in the US. Imagine meeting with Frank Lloyd Wright and thinking that this was it, right? I love that. So his case study learning continues. He writes to Severid that he's compiling everything that's ever been done in the field of the hanging roof. He tells him what his thesis is going to be. He asks for more information. He then, of course, features the Dorton Arena on the cover of his thesis. Writes to Severid his long-term correspondence and says, you gave me the inspiration to write this book. I'll always be grateful to you for that. So 1954 is where we are now. Of course, his early work, 1955 to 57, incredibly inspirational work, groundbreaking work, work that wasn't really being done anywhere. It's important to contextualize the dates here. Severid then writes an article for Progressive Architecture magazine and writes about Frei Otto, introduces Frei to the publication world around the world, and includes these sketches that you can see. And in it says, he says, I'd like to introduce Frei Otto to everybody. And then at the end, he says, well, we're certain to hear more from him again in this field. I'm also including a sketch from the Berlin Congress Hall, 1956, that Severid worked on with Hugh Stubbins. There was a feud that ensued because Otto's critique of the engineering of this. And those who know the story know it became pretty contentious pretty quickly. The contention of this feud made it so that Otto's work looking for a teaching position became more complicated. He had written to Professor Catalano at NC State, North Carolina State, looking for a teaching position. And after a couple years, expresses his concern that he wasn't going to be able to find one. People wanted him to teach in engineering. He wanted to teach in architecture. He wanted to do research, didn't just want to teach. These are hard positions to fill, right? So what I love about this quote from the letter, again, to Severid, is that thankfully, he did not give up looking for teaching. But he was going to, and then talks, of course, about the work that he's doing in Berlin for the IL. Thankfully, he was offered a position to teach. His first studio he ever taught was at Washington University, which is in St. Louis, Missouri, in the US, 1958. This is an interesting distinction I want to sort of say here. It was a 16-week design studio. So it's an immersive, heavy credit studio where generally in the US, of course, we have design projects, you're supposed to develop it. He was hired by Dean Passano. Dean Passano was also an architect and an engineer. So he understood this overlap between the two ideas. Quick context about American education. It was obsessed with practice-oriented, functional trade school preparation. Codes, code review, program review. It was all meant to teach people how to just do what practice was going to be. Now, in the mid-1950s, there were some rumblings with this. There was some changes that were starting to emerge from this, but also Frei Otto recognized that there was other internationally renowned designers, of course, like Gropius and Mies and Wachsman and Fuller, who also were teaching in the US, and they had these research and design positions as well. So Fuller, if you don't know, his experiments at the Black Mountain College with these great model making things, this was radical, crazy radical to US education, did not continue. And then there's a group called the Texas Rangers at the University of Texas at Austin, which they decided that what the US education really needed was more formative model making experiences. And so within this context, I present to you then the work that Otto did in his first lecture. So he did lots of form finding, science and nature things. He relies on case study. There was no program, there was no design. It was all focused on discovery. So there was direct sensory experiences. He had people make things, emphasis on representation and communication. So I'm going to show you slides from the work. What I love about this is, again, this connection between thinking and making and the models that were produced. Some look familiar, right? Yeah, so some look very familiar. Some are quite novel. Some are extraordinary. 1958. I'm sure you're looking at things here and saying, we've seen these before, or we've seen these later. And that, in fact, is exactly what's happened. There's only about 16 people in this entire class. And they built this work, of course, through case study. So here's an idea for a project. Please build it. They would build it. They would analyze it, right? And over, then this idea of learning how to make came from the confidence of case study. Experimentation came from case study. If you compare some of the work that you just saw with work that Otto had just done, we see direct, like, please rebuild the pavilion from Cologne. Got it, right? Please build the 2 up, 2 down from Kessel, or the dance pavilion. And then they would. And so then the students would build it and be able to photograph it. There's other work that was done there that became inspiring or upcycled through Otto's work, which I find just absolutely fascinating. This experiment that I think led directly to the form of the aviary, the cover of the Bremen, and of course then the German pavilion study model. Here's the thing, it wasn't just about case study. Those of you who know the work know that it's not just about imagination, it's about how can we make sure that there's a technical component to it. So the model making always has measurement models. Measurement model number 1, the hanging shell. The hanging shell is quite interesting and quite unique, and I think precedes Easler's work by a year. Those of you who know Easler's work and where he first presented the hanging shell was in '59, and here Otto is doing this in his coursework. The measurement model here again of the too high, too low. The idea of it's not just about making it, but being able to measure it, test it. And then one of the students, John Cox's work, with this incredibly interesting project, he was then invited or came to Berlin and wrote an essay in the Mitteilungen, the Information 61, about how to make measurement models of this particular model. So there's this legacy enduring of that. And Cox's work actually was then continued in '59 And this was the work that was shown in some of the tensile structures. It was an incredibly formative teaching experience. I contend must have been his most formative, in fact. I want to get to his next work at Yale in 1960. This was a 6-week seminar. That's much shorter. And this was a design-based project for design of assembly and exhibition. This student design work was space frames, tents, large hanging tent enclosure. All of these things were in fact featured in the MoMA catalog from 1972 as work of Frei Otto. It was the first appearance of the large tree-like support system. And of course, we know from his work how he was obsessed with the idea of self-forming structures, including the tent-like tree structures. His work continued, and this is an important part. He wasn't just an educator, but he's then writing. He's advocating for these things, and he's writing about this work technically. This was one of the great finds through the archives, was this sketch of the different types of visual classification of structural typologies. As he's teaching and as he's writing, he then makes this diagram to try to explain, how do I explain to students how different form and forces are related? And so he's making this diagram of it, and I contend that there's a sort of morphological and proto-parametricism involved with this, of trying to do that. He formalizes this eventually and includes this in his documentation. His lectures were light on technical components and were heavy on inspiration. They really settled on, like, why should we do this, not how do we do it? And I think it's quite interesting that the expectations people would have would be, I'm going to learn about how to make a lightweight structure, and instead he'd talk to you about why it's important to build with lightweight construction. 1962, his last teaching appointment then at UC Berkeley, was a 4-week graduate seminar. It's shorter now, right, by even more. It's a 4-week. This is remarkable for a couple things. There was a 40-page book that was published by the students. This book, which was actually, I contend, illustrated by Ed Allen. If those of you know the great American author Ed Allen, he was one of the students in this studio, as was Larry Medlin. So there's a 40-page book where they actually, Otto's technical lessons are illustrated here. And so they did a step-by-step of the hanging chain model. And here I'll show you some slides of what they did. Imagine this in 4 weeks, educators among us. They're laying out grid shell, tying it together, getting ready to lift it up. I love the idea that, I mean, the details are pretty nice. They're pretty heavy. I think their reflections say that the rebar was a little heavy. I think the idea of building this non-crane in the middle of it and just getting people out there and lifting it in place, not a hard hat in sight. And look at that, he's straddling around it, lifting the whole thing up. They got it up to a certain height, but it was too heavy. And it started to bow. It wasn't working. So they had to brace it temporarily. They had to redo the structure. They had it come down and had it come right back up. And eventually, this was corresponding then with also the International Association for Shells and Spatial Structure conference, where then this finished design work in the courtyard, which we'll see here in just a second, was then part of the exhibition of that. Just an incredible finished product. Quite remarkable, in fact, I would say, for 4 weeks worth of work. I want to get to the last part here, which has to do with how this became where we are now. He was reflecting on his teaching, and he was tired of the short-term teaching appointments. This is very hard for his work. He's developing his work, and these are hard things to be able to do this quite quickly. And so was it worth it? So he desired something that was more pure research. And so here's a diagram that he created in 1963 from his sketchbook. My concept intended a pure research institute for top-level research, free of teaching commitments. High-profile instructors, or quote, famous people, would select the best students. Courses would skip normal teaching in lieu of workshops, and the terminal degree would be a PhD. He's proposing what we have here. Of course, he was named the director, 64, and there was this idealized philosophical version, I contend, of the American pedagogy of the 1960s, with this focus again on freedom of research. And I love this Studentarbeiten's work of the experiments in bubbles, where this was the cover of their thesis. I guarantee you're not going to see this as a cover of thesis in too many other institutions in the world, right? I absolutely love it. I love the idea that everybody must be allowed to take their own way. And I would just say that these experiences, I contend, were formative to shaping his future educational activities and research interests in Germany and elsewhere. And you can see how this idea turns into physical models, which turns into ideas of space, which turns into ideas of nature. And I would just leave you with the rest of the conference with this question of what does the legacy of being an educator mean today? As practitioners, as researchers, as builders, designers, architects, engineers, all the wonderful interdisciplinary questions that we have. I want to thank all the people who helped me find and develop this very interesting research. Thank you very much.